Chapter 1. The Garden Party. It was the kind of summer day that could make one forget unpleasant things, like unpaid bills, dry spells in the garden, and the inevitable scandals that brewed under the surface of village life. The sky was blue, without blemish, the lawns trimmed to military neatness, and the rose bushes blooming in obedient rows around St. Mildred's Church. Miss Jane Marple, seated under the dappled shade of a large copper beech tree, sipped her tea with serene detachment. She was well into her 90th year, but her eyes, sharp, pale, and deceptively gentle, missed nothing. They flitted from one guest to another, quietly recording every curious glance, every whispered exchange, every small impropriety masked in polite smiles. For in St. Mary Mead, or in this case, the neighbouring village of Lavenstock, it was the quiet events, the tiny lapses in courtesy, that so often signalled the onset of trouble. "Jane," said Mrs. Weatherby, leaning over with a rustle of her lace shawl, "have you seen that dreadful ring? The one Vivian's got displayed in the marquee?" Miss Marple turned her head slightly, but did not immediately answer. Her eyes were already fixed on the centre of the event, a neatly arranged white marquee with a small glass case glinting in the sunlight. Inside, surrounded by a frill of embroidered velvet and a placard handwritten in florid script, sat the object in question, a large onyx and platinum ring, heavy and old-fashioned, its design more suited to the Elizabethan stage than a village garden party. "Ah," Miss Marple said mildly, "Lady Margaret's ring." Mrs. Weatherby gave a theatrical shudder. "They call it the widow's ring now. Not very tasteful, is it, putting something like that on display?" "It's an odd choice for a fete," Miss Marple agreed, though Miss Marchmont has always had a flair for dramatics. Vivian Marchmont, Lady Margaret's only surviving grandniece and the current mistress of Ormsley House, was at that very moment laughing lightly with the vicar's wife. She was a striking woman of perhaps 35, with rich auburn, hair arranged in a sophisticated chignon, and a preference for sharply tailored clothes that set her apart from the other ladies, who favoured florals and cardigans. A silk scarf was knotted at her throat with studied elegance, and she carried herself with an air of someone used to being watched. "The ring belonged to my great-aunt Margaret," Vivian was saying with a practised smile. "She wore it every day after my great-uncle passed, insisted it was a family heirloom, though none of us had ever seen it before. She claimed it was cursed." "Cursed?" Mrs. Beadle, the schoolmistress, looked horrified. "Surely not." Vivian chuckled, her tone airy. "Oh, you know how it is. Old jewellery always comes with some story. According to family law, every woman who wears it suffers a misfortune. Madness, sudden death, scandal. It varies depending on who's telling it." "And now you wear it?" Mrs. Beadle asked, her voice dropping. Vivian tilted her chin slightly. "Of course, I'm not afraid of superstitions." Miss Marple, from her vantage point under the beech tree, watched this exchange with quiet interest. The ring glinted blackly in the glass case. Beautiful, yes, but cold. Too cold. She had seen such things before. Not cursed objects, of course. Miss Marple was no fool, but symbols. Items that carried weight not because of magic, but because of human belief. Sometimes the belief in a curse could do far more damage than any hex ever could. "She always was a strange one," Mrs. Weatherby muttered. even as a girl, spent her holidays in the city, came back with heirs, and now with all that money. From Lady Margaret? Yes, Miss Marple murmured. Quite a change in fortune. The afternoon meandered along in typical village fashion. There was a raffle, won by Mr. Ellery, the butcher, followed by a tea-tent scandal involving a wasp in the cream jug, and finally a performance of madrigals by the women's chorus, who sang with enthusiastic, if not entirely accurate harmony. But it was the ring that lingered in conversation. Children whispered about it behind the lemonade stall. Old Mrs. Salter claimed she'd once seen it move on its own during a séance. Reverend Pomeroy, ever the pragmatist, dismissed the entire matter as nonsense, but could not explain the tremor in his voice when he blessed the tent before closing ceremonies. By 5:30, the sun had begun its slow descent, and the guests began to take their leave. Miss Marple remained seated as the tents were dismantled and the last of the strawberry scones were boxed away. She sipped her second cup of tea and watched as Vivian carefully removed the ring from its display, wrapping it in a handkerchief and placing it into her handbag with deliberate care. "A strange business," Miss Marple murmured. "What's that?" Mrs. Weatherby asked. "The way she handled the ring," said Miss Marple, "so careful, as though she were afraid of it, or perhaps afraid someone else might be." That evening, Miss Marple took the bus back to St. Mary Mead. The countryside rolled past her window in soft golden light, but her thoughts were not on the landscape. She was thinking of Ormsley House, of Lady Margaret, stern and proud in her old age, who had never allowed visitors to touch her jewellery, of Vivian Marchmont, with her fashionable clothes and her polished smile, of the ring, black as night, and its sudden reappearance after the old lady's death. She was still thinking of it when she took her cocoa at 10 o'clock, and again when she folded back her bed covers with her usual precision. Something about the ring didn't sit right. Not the object itself, perhaps, but its timing. And Miss Marple had long since learned that timing, in matters of death, was everything. The next morning, as the village clock struck 7, Vivian Marchmont was found dead in the drawing-room of Ormsley House. The ring, still on her finger, glinted dully in the early morning light, and the expression on her face, twisted, frozen, almost pleading, was one Miss Marple would come to know very well, the look of someone who had understood the truth 1 second too late. Chapter 2. The Village Reacts. The village of Lavenstock had seen its share of scandals, elopements, missing wills, even a minor poisoning in 1927 that was quietly hushed up by the vicar's wife, but nothing quite like the death of Vivian Marchmont. That a young, healthy woman should be found dead in her own drawing-room less than 24 hours after publicly dismissing the legend of a cursed ring was more than unfortunate. It was practically theatrical. And villages, as Miss Marple well knew, were deeply theatrical places, every house a stage, every inhabitant a player, each with their own script, cues, and secrets. By 10 o'clock, the morning after the fete, the news had travelled from Ormsley House to the High Street, and was being repeated with subtle variations in every shop, parlour, and pantry. At the bakery, Mrs. Trowbridge was telling Mrs. Altham, the grocer's sister, that Vivian had been found slumped over like a broken doll, with the widow's ring still on her finger. Over at the post office, Mr. Sims insisted he had it on good authority, from the boy who delivered for the Marchmonts, that the doctor had said she looked frightened to death. By midday, someone was claiming the body had been discovered with a Bible open on her lap, turned to the Book of Revelation, though no one could quite agree who had started that version. At the centre of it all, quite naturally, was Miss Marple. She had received the news not from rumour, but by telegram, a courtesy from her old friend Colonel Melrose, now retired and living in nearby Broadhollow, but ever alert to anything that might pique her interest. The message had been brief. Unexpected death. Vivian Marchmont. Local police baffled. Ring involved. Your counsel, if convenient. And so, that same afternoon, Miss Marple found herself back in Lavenstock, walking the quiet lane toward Ormsley House, with the kind of unhurried pace that suggested nothing more than a gentle visit. She wore her pale blue coat, a hat with an unfashionable brim, and carried her gloves in one hand, having found it too warm to wear them properly. Her handbag, though modest, contained a notebook, 2 fountain pens, and a collection of old clippings, just in case. A constable stood near the gate, clearly unused to guarding properties more suited to floral teas than crime scenes. "I'm here to see Inspector Crail," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "We've met before. Kindly tell him Miss Marple from St. Mary Mead is here on invitation." The tuche constable, clearly flustered, nodded and disappeared down the gravel path. Ormsley House was an elegant but slightly faded estate, ivy climbing its western wall, lead-paned windows winking in the sun. Miss Marple noted the state of the flower beds, respectable, the dust on the lower sills, slightly neglected, and the half-burnt citronella candle still sitting on a table near the drawing-room's open French doors. It didn't take long before Inspector Crail emerged, tall, lean, moustached, and clearly uncomfortable with Miss Marple's presence, though bound by civility and Colonel Melrose's name. "Miss Marple, I'm told you've been briefed?" "I've heard enough to know. There are more questions than answers, Inspector. I won't interfere, I assure you." He gave a gruff nod and led her into the house. The maid found her just after 7. She brought in the breakfast tray, saw Miss Marchmont sitting as if asleep. Only she wasn't. They stepped into the drawing-room. It was as Miss Marple expected, tasteful but curated, every object placed with a deliberate sense of harmony. And there, in the centre chair near the hearth, was the absence, a faint outline on the cushion, an untouched tea-tray on the table nearby, and the faintest smear of lipstick on a delicate china cup. "She died seated, no sign of struggle," Crail said. "No bruises, no wounds. The doctor says heart failure, but he's puzzled. No history, no sign of strain, just gone." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her eyes scanning the room. "And the ring? Still on her finger when she was found. We have it now, of course, sent for analysis. No marks, no unusual residues, just a ring, heavy, unattractive thing." "It unnerved her," Miss Marple murmured. Crail raised an eyebrow. "You think the ring frightened her to death?" "Not the ring," she replied softly. "What it represented. Fear has a curious way of seizing the heart when we are already too tense to breathe." Crail cleared his throat. "You wouldn't be implying—" "I'm implying nothing," said Miss Marple with a smile. "Only observing." Later that afternoon, as Miss Marple sat once more beneath the copper beech in the churchyard, her favourite vantage point, she was joined by Reverend Pomeroy's wife, who had brought along a basket of shortbread under the pretence of comfort. "I suppose this means the fate is cursed now," she said mournfully. "Vivian dead, and that horrid ring at the centre of it all." "Has anyone else worn the ring, do you know?" Miss Marple asked conversationally. "Only Lady Margaret. Never let anyone else touch it. She was very particular. Vivian said it skipped a generation, but I expect she made that up. More romantic, you see. Lady Margaret," Miss Marple repeated. "She died in her sleep, didn't she?" "Yes, though the maid said her bedroom was in disarray when she was found. She'd been up during the night, apparently. Very unlike her." "And the maid, Doris, wasn't it? Still at Ormsley?" The Reverend's wife frowned. "Yes, though she's been rather nervous lately. Poor thing was the one who found Vivian after all." Miss Marple nodded gently. Her mind was already turning, assembling the pieces. Lady Margaret, Vivian. A ring passed, or claimed. Whispers of madness. A maid with a nervous temperament. A death that left no mark, but too much meaning. "Funny thing about curses," Miss Marple said, almost to herself. "They're rarely about the object itself. More often, it's about who wants it, and what they're willing to do to keep it." The vicar's wife blinked. "You don't mean to say—" But Miss Marple only smiled, reached for a shortbread, and took a thoughtful bite. The game, as she well knew, had only just begun. Chapter 3. The Legacy of Lady Margaret. 2 days after Vivian Marchmont's sudden death, the village of Lavenstock had shifted from open shock to hushed speculation. There was no more public talk of curses, not in front of the constables, at least, but behind closed doors, opinions had formed with alarming speed. It was generally agreed that the ring had something to do with it, even by those who scoffed at superstition. But whether it had been poison, fear, or some unknown ailment was still up for spirited debate, and in the middle of this quiet storm, Miss Marple moved with gentle certainty, like a cat navigating a crowded parlour, light-footed, invisible to some, impossible to ignore by others. Her next visit took her to the home of Mrs. Isabel Hartley, Lady Margaret's old companion and friend of many years, who lived in a handsome red-brick house near the village green, with a peacock weather vane, and a garden so neat it looked combed. Isabel received Miss Marple with the air of a woman who had been waiting to speak but did not wish to appear eager. She was in her 70s, dignified, and dressed in dove grey. Tea was served in thin-handled china cups, and the lemon drizzle cake had been arranged on a silver stand, though Miss Marple noticed that neither had been touched before her arrival. "I don't suppose you believe the nonsense about the curse," Isabel said, pouring tea with a steady hand. "I prefer to believe in motives, Miss Hartley," Miss Marple said mildly. "They're more dependable than legends." Isabel gave a tight little smile. "Then I expect you've already gathered that Vivian wasn't universally beloved." Miss Marple waited. "She wasn't cruel exactly," Isabel continued, "but she had a way of reminding people who was in charge. Even as a child, she had that quality. Ambition without apology. Lady Margaret doted on her, of course, though I'm not convinced she ever truly trusted her." "Lady Margaret was a strong character herself, was she not?" asked Miss Marple. "Very. Imperious, secretive, and quite sentimental beneath it all, though she loathed sentimentality in others. She collected people, you see, housekeepers, gardeners, even the odd village child, always drawn in and quietly repelled if they disappointed her. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Did she ever mention the ring? Isabel's eyes darkened. Not once. I only saw it after her death. It appeared suddenly in the safe. Vivian claimed she'd inherited it, but I remember Margaret saying she had no valuable jewellery at all. No mention of an heirloom or a family piece. Nothing. And believe me, Jane, Lady Margaret would have made a speech of it if the ring were part of some grand lineage. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. Then where did it come from? Isabel set down her teacup with a faint clink. That, my dear, is the first mystery. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took a quiet walk around the grounds of Ormsley House. The constables had departed, save for one watching the gates, and the house itself was sealed for the time being, pending the coroner's inquest. But the garden, quiet and overgrown in parts, was accessible. She walked slowly along the path leading to the side terrace, where a wrought-iron bench faced a koi pond and an old statue of a Greek muse, its nose long since chipped. It was there that she found Doris Bell, the maid, seated and wiping at her eyes with a lace-trimmed handkerchief. Miss Marple sat beside her, not speaking for a moment. The young woman was in her early 20s, thin and pale with a permanently nervous expression and hands that trembled slightly, even when at rest. "It's a lovely place," Miss Marple said softly, "though I imagine it feels quite different now." Doris nodded mutely. "May I ask," Miss Marple continued, "how long you worked for Miss Marchmont?" 2 years, ma'am. Came on after Lady Margaret passed. I was her lady's maid before that. So you knew the house well. Its rhythms, its quiet hours." Doris gave a watery sniff. "Yes, ma'am." Miss Marple glanced toward the drawing-room windows. "You were the one who found Miss Marchmont." The maid nodded. She was sitting like always, in that green chair. The curtains were still drawn. At first I thought she was sleeping, but then I saw her eyes. Miss Marple waited. "They were wide open," Doris whispered, "like she'd seen something awful. But the room was empty. Had she seemed troubled the night before?" Doris hesitated. She'd been in a strange mood all day, snappish, and she kept holding the ring, turning it around on her finger. She took it off twice, and once she dropped it. It rolled under the chair, and she screamed. "Screamed?" Miss Marple asked, her tone unchanged. "Yes, ma'am. Not a little squeal. A proper scream. Said it burned her." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "Did you notice a mark?" "No, ma'am. None at all." There was a long pause, the sound of breeze rustling through the garden trees above them. "Did Lady Margaret ever mention the ring to you?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Doris hesitated. "Only once. She said I was never to touch it, and that, if anything ever happened, to her I was to leave it where it lay." "Where it lay?" "Yes, in the jewellery box. The small one, blue velvet." Miss Marple rose slowly. "Thank you, Miss Bell. You've been very helpful." She walked back toward the lane in thoughtful silence. There was something peculiar about that instruction. Leave it where it lay. Not pass it on, not inherit, not display. It was almost as though Lady Margaret had wanted the ring to be forgotten or buried, but Vivian had done the opposite. She had made it the centrepiece of a village fete. She had drawn attention to it, claimed it publicly, and now she was dead. Miss Marple paused just before the gate. She looked back at the house, its windows shuttered, its garden quiet. The dead had left clues, as they always did. They whispered through servants, through objects, through offhand remarks, and things not quite said. All Miss Marple had to do was listen, and she was very, very good at listening. Chapter 4. The Inquest at Ormsley. The inquest into the death of Vivian Marchmont was held, somewhat unceremoniously, in the small library of Ormsley House. With the drawing-room considered inappropriate due to its recent infamy, the library was chosen for its relative neutrality and good lighting. The armchairs had been pushed back, a narrow oak table placed beneath the front windows, and a clerk from the magistrate's office sat primly beside the coroner with a squeaky pen and an inkpot no one could quite stop knocking. It was a subdued affair, respectful certainly, but pulsing with the unspoken weight of the unexplained. The village, it seemed, had divided itself into two camps, those who whispered of poisons and those who whispered of curses. Neither side could offer proof, but both were eager to listen in case someone else might provide it. Miss Marple was seated quietly along the back wall. She wore her usual dove-grey coat and a simple brooch shaped like a thistle, one of several that had once belonged to her mother. Her knitting rested in her lap, untouched. She needed no distraction today. Today she was listening. The coroner, a thin man with the unfortunate habit of clearing his throat whenever he grew uncertain, began with a calm reading of Vivian Marchmont's age, occupation, and the circumstances of her discovery. Found, deceased in her home, seated in an armchair. No signs of external trauma, no forced entry. The time of death estimated between 9 p.m. and midnight. A post-mortem revealed no significant pathology, no rupture, no aneurysm, no prior cardiovascular condition. There was a pause. In other words, he said, the cause of death remains officially listed as undetermined, though a failure of the heart is most likely. A quiet murmur spread among those gathered. Miss Marple's brows lifted, but she said nothing. Now then, the coroner continued, we shall hear from Miss Doris Bell, the deceased's maid. Doris entered pale but composed, and took her place with careful poise. Her voice was soft, and though she stammered once or twice, she told her story clearly. She had brought the breakfast tray as always, found Miss Marchmont seated and unresponsive, and had summoned the housekeeper, who in turn contacted the authorities. "Did your mistress complain of illness the day before?" asked the coroner gently. "No, sir. She seemed nervous, a bit short-tempered, but not ill." "Had she eaten anything unusual?" "Not that I know of. Just tea and a slice of Madeira cake." "Where was the ring?" "On her finger, sir. The left hand. Had she spoken of it recently?" Doris hesitated. She said it didn't belong to her. This caused a ripple through the crowd. The coroner leaned forward. "I beg your pardon?" "She said it once," Doris repeated. "Not to me directly. I overheard her. She was in the drawing-room, speaking on the telephone the day before the fete. She said, 'It doesn't belong to me, but I have to show it.'" The coroner cleared his throat again and nodded. "That will be all. Thank you, Miss Bell." Doris stepped down, visibly shaken. Miss Marple remained still, her eyes lowered, That phrase, "it doesn't belong to me," had an unsettling weight. It suggested guilt, or at the very least, pressure. Who had compelled Vivian to wear the ring? Or had she compelled herself against her better judgment? Next came Dr. Alwyn Merton, the local physician. He was a portly, affable man who had delivered most of the village's residents into the world and guided many more quietly out of it. Vivian was in excellent health, he confirmed. No history of arrhythmia. She had a mild anxiety condition, nothing severe, no drugs in her system aside from a trace amount of laudanum, consistent with the tincture she used for sleep on occasion. Was there enough to cause harm? Not unless she drank an entire bottle, which she did not. Could shock alone cause such a death? The coroner asked. Fright, say? Dr. Merton shrugged uneasily. In rare cases, yes, but it would be exceedingly rare in someone her age and condition. Miss Marple caught something in his tone, something deliberately restrained. She watched his fingers. They tapped, the table ever so lightly, in a pattern she recognized. A man not quite saying everything he knew. He stepped down with a little more haste than was necessary. The coroner proceeded to the final witness, Isabel Hartley. Miss Hartley, now dressed in stark black, walked to the front of the room with dignity. She looked straight ahead as she gave her statement. That Vivian had not spoken to her on the day of the fete, that they had exchanged only a polite nod in passing, and that Lady Margaret had never, to her knowledge, intended Vivienne to inherit the ring. In fact, she added, her voice calm, Lady Margaret did not consider it a family piece at all. I believe she found it rather sinister. She kept it locked away, never wore it in her later years. Why do you think Miss Marchmont chose to display it publicly? Asked the coroner. There was a pause. I think, Isabel said slowly, she wanted to prove she wasn't afraid. Miss Marple felt a small chill at the back of her neck. The coroner closed the inquest with a rather vague summary. The official verdict was left open. Death by natural causes, possibly precipitated by emotional shock. There was no evidence of foul play. But as the guests began to rise, their chairs scraping politely across the floor, Miss Marple sat perfectly still, because she had heard it. Not in the testimony, not even in the evidence, but in a single word, spoken by Doris Bell. A word she had glossed over the first time. She said it didn't belong to me, but I have to show it. Show. Not wear, not own, but show. Vivian hadn't chosen to wear the ring out of vanity or greed. She had felt obligated, compelled by someone or something else, which meant this story wasn't about inheritance at all. It was about performance, and in Miss Marple's considerable experience, those who perform too well often have something very real to hide. Chapter 5. A Curious Conversation at the Green Man. It was not Miss Marple's custom to frequent public houses, but as she herself often remarked, one must go where the story is being told. And that week, the story of Vivian Marchmont's death was being told, retold, and revised more times than the hymn board on a busy Sunday, mostly over pints and pork pies at the Green Man. The pub, nestled on the north edge of the village green, was old in the way respectable places ought to be. Low beams, sloping floorboards, and a permanent smell of smoke and sage stuffing. It was well after lunchtime, and most of the usual patrons were, on their second drink when Miss Marple entered, as demurely as if she were stepping into a church. She chose a table near the hearth, ordered tea with just a touch of milk, and waited. It wasn't long before she was joined. "I saw you at the inquest," said a voice, gravelly but not unkind. Miss Marple looked up and smiled. "Mr. Hodge, how pleasant!" William Hodge was one of those men who had done everything and nothing. A former groundskeeper, sometime gravedigger, and unofficial expert on village comings and goings. He had a face like a dried apple, and a fondness for telling stories that always began with, "Mind you, I'm not one for gossip, but—" He sat heavily across from her with a pint in hand. "Strange business that," he said, tapping his glass. "Miss Marchmont. Young, healthy, but gone just like that." Miss Marple nodded. "She seemed afraid, they say," he continued. "Doris Bell's got nerves like wet paper, but she swears Vivian looked like she'd seen the devil." "She may have seen something worse," Miss Marple replied. Hodge raised his eyebrows. "Worse than the devil?" Someone she trusted. That gave him pause. He took a thoughtful sip. "Funny you say that. Reminds me of something I heard months ago now, before Lady Margaret passed." "Oh?" He glanced around, as though the mahogany walls themselves might be listening. "Keep this between us. But one evening, old Reggie from the delivery stable comes in, half-soaked and 3/4 cross. Says he's been turned out from Ormsley House after 20 years of fetching parcels." "Turned out?" Miss Marple asked. "Just like that. No warning. Seems he delivered a package Lady Margaret wasn't expecting. Said it arrived from the continent, no return label. Bit heavy." Miss Marple leaned slightly forward. "What happened?" "Well, Reggie says she went pale as anything, asked who'd signed for it, then told him to get off the property and never return. 2 days later, she cancelled all her standing orders. Died not long after." "Do you know what was in the package?" "Not a clue." Reggie tried to peek, but it was wrapped up tighter than a bishop's conscience. Miss Marple allowed herself a smile. "But you believe it upset her?" "I do." Shook her. And Lady Margaret wasn't one to be shaken. There was a pause as Miss Marple took her tea. "Did anyone else know about the parcel?" "Only Reggie told me, and I don't think he blabbed to anyone else." "But get this, Vivian turned up not 2 days later. Been living in London for years, hadn't set foot near the place. Suddenly, she's all over the place, looking after dear Aunt Margaret. Didn't leave till the will was read." That, Miss Marple thought, was interesting. Very interesting. She thanked Mr. Hodge politely and left the pub a few minutes later, her knitting untouched and her mind churning. A package, with no return address, something heavy, enough to send a formidable woman into a rage and exile a long-trusted employee. And then Vivian appears? A woman who had not seen her great-aunt in years, suddenly back and attentive just before a death and an inheritance. She had come, Miss Marple now believed, not to care for Lady Margaret, but to retrieve whatever was in that parcel, perhaps the ring. But then why the theatricality of displaying it at the fête? Why not sell it quietly, as others had done with old jewellery for centuries? Because Vivienne hadn't retrieved the ring herself. She'd been given it, or rather told to display it, and not by Lady Margaret. Miss Marple had always trusted pattern, and the pattern now was of pressure. Vivian had been scared. She hadn't claimed the ring. She'd shown it, unwillingly. Just like she'd said, she was, Miss Marple felt sure, now being manipulated. Perhaps blackmailed, and that meant the person behind the curtain, whoever had sent that package, was still in the village, watching and waiting. Chapter 6. The second Willet was a rainy Thursday morning when Miss Marple paid an unannounced visit to the Lavenstock solicitor, Mr. Percival Hartley, not to be confused with Miss Isabel Hartley, though the two had once been cousins by marriage, until a minor dispute over a stained-glass window at St. Mildred's had ended all friendly relations. Mr. Hartley's office was situated in a prim Georgian building off the High Street, where brass door-knockers gleamed despite the weather, and hedges were trimmed with architectural precision. Miss Marple was shown into a dark-panelled room that smelled faintly of lavender polish and old paper. The solicitor, a man of dignified manner and precisely trimmed moustache, looked up from his desk with mild curiosity. "Miss Marple," he said, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" "I shan't take much of your time, Mr. Hartley," she said, settling herself gently into a hard-backed chair. "Only a few questions about Lady Margaret's will." Hartley's expression flickered, barely, but enough for Miss Marple to catch it. "She died over a year ago, you know," he said. "The estate was settled. Vivian Marchmont was the sole beneficiary." "Yes, I understand that." Miss Marple folded her gloves in her lap. "But I wondered, purely hypothetically, you understand, whether there was ever a previous will." There was a pause. Hartley glanced toward a locked filing cabinet at his side. "I'm not at liberty to disclose private records." "Oh, of course not," Miss Marple interrupted politely. "But it would be such a comfort to know if Lady Margaret ever considered someone else in her final wishes, especially given the unusual circumstances surrounding Miss Marchmont's sudden death." Hartley looked at her long and hard. She met his gaze calmly. At length he stood and unlocked the cabinet. "I cannot release the document," he said, drawing out a folder with deliberate care. "But I can confirm that Lady Margaret executed a will 10 years ago, in which the bulk of her estate, including the contents of her jewellery box, was to pass to her companion of many years, Miss Isabel Hartley." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. "How curious!" "The later will, made scarcely 3 weeks before her death, entirely superseded it. That document left everything to Miss Marchmont." "I see." She tilted her head. "Was the ring listed in either?" Hartley hesitated. "In the original will, yes. Referred to as the onyx ring, never to be worn. In the second, no mention, not even in the inventory, no." He paused. In fact, there was some debate over whether the ring existed at all. Lady Margaret made a note in her first testament. "This ring is to remain locked. If I pass before removing it, leave it untouched." Miss Marple sat very still. "Would anyone else have known about the ring? Other than you?" "I doubt it," said Hartley. "Lady Margaret was deeply private, but I must admit," he added, reluctantly, "I thought it strange that Vivian never mentioned the ring after the funeral. Then, to display it publicly at the fete." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, almost as if she were being told to. She rose. "Thank you, Mr. Hartley. You've been most illuminating." That afternoon Miss Marple called upon Miss Isabel Hartley, who for once received her, without fuss. "I expect you know," Miss Marple said gently, that Lady Margaret once named you as her heir." Isabel, seated by the hearth, gave no sign of surprise. "Yes, she told me so once, long ago. But not in the end? No." Isabel looked away. "I suppose she changed her mind. Did she ever tell you that?" A pause. "No." Miss Marple sat forward slightly. "Miss Hartley, I've been thinking about that parcel, the one delivered shortly before Lady Margaret's death, a heavy one, from the continent with no sender listed." Isabel flinched almost imperceptibly. "You've heard of it?" Miss Marple asked. Yes, she mentioned it, only once. She was quite shaken." "Did she say what was inside?" "She didn't have to." Isabel's voice was very quiet. "I knew." There was a long silence. "She told me years ago she'd locked the ring away forever," Isabel whispered, "that it frightened her. She believed it brought, not misfortune, exactly, but conflict. She said it always reappeared when someone lied, when someone in the family betrayed another. And she was betrayed. I believe so. She had begun to distrust Vivian, but I don't think she could face what that meant. Instead of confronting her, she rewrote her will. Miss Marple said nothing. She was thinking now of the word show, repeated like a thread through the last week's events. Vivian's frightened expression, the line in Lady Margaret's first will, and now this, a ring sent back, unbidden from some unseen hand. She stood. One last thing. Did Vivian know about the original will? Isabel's face hardened. "Yes, I told her." Miss Marple nodded, as though that was precisely what she expected to hear. That evening, seated once again in her parlour in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple laid out her notes. The facts as she now understood them formed a distinctive, delicate pattern. The ring had been feared by Lady Margaret, not for magic, but for memory. She left instructions for it to remain untouched. A parcel arrived from abroad and changed everything. A second will appeared shortly after, naming Vivian as heir. Vivian displayed the ring in public, nervously, perhaps unwillingly. She died shortly thereafter. But in all of this, one thing had remained constant. The ring had returned. Not passed, not gifted, but returned. And that meant someone had sent it, someone who knew what it symbolized, someone who wanted it seen, someone who had perhaps been watching all along and was still out there. Miss Marple leaned back, her knitting forgotten. The ring was not a curse. It was a warning, and whoever had ignored it, Vivian, perhaps others, had paid the price. Chapter 7. The trap behind the velvet box-it was not in Miss Marple's nature to set traps with cruelty. But she had always believed in justice, not the heavy-handed kind of courtroom dramatics, but the gentle, piercing sort that reveals truth by leaving nowhere for lies to hide. And so it was that 3 days after her visit to Percival Hartley's office, Miss Marple paid a call to Reverend Pomeroy's wife, under the harmless pretext of delivering quince jelly and a few idle thoughts about flower arrangements for the harvest festival. Their conversation, however, ended with a most calculated remark. "Such a shame," Miss Marple said, setting down her teacup, "that no one knows who sent the parcel that changed everything. I imagine it's only a matter of time before someone confesses. Secrets have a dreadful way of surfacing when one least expects. The vicar's wife, wide-eyed, agreed that they always did. By tea-time the next day, the remark had reached precisely the ears Miss Marple intended it to. That evening, Miss Marple wrote a note on her pale blue notepaper, folded it, and placed it in a matching envelope with a dainty floral seal. She addressed it, Miss Doris Bell, Ormsley Cottage Room, The Servants' Annex, Ormsley Estate. The note read, "My dear, I believe it would be wise for us to speak privately. This Sunday, just after evensong, the bench beneath the yew tree. Yours most sincerely, J.M." She posted it by hand and waited. Sunday arrived grey and still, with the air heavy as though something unsaid hung over the village like a draped curtain. After the service, where the choir sang a slightly off-key rendition of Abide With Me, Miss Marple walked slowly to the churchyard, nodding to familiar faces and pretending to pause at the rose-beds before taking her seat on the bench beneath. The yew, she didn't have to wait long. Doris appeared, hat slightly askew, eyes darting nervously. She approached the bench like a guilty schoolgirl. "You asked to see me, Miss Marple?" she said, barely above a whisper. Miss Marple patted the space beside her. "Sit, my dear. No one will overhear us here." Doris obeyed, glancing toward the gate. "I'm not in trouble, am I?" she asked. "No," Miss Marple said gently. "But I think you've been frightened, and frightened people sometimes hide things that are better brought into the light." Doris twisted her handkerchief. "It's not what you think." "I'm not thinking anything yet," Miss Marple said, "only wondering. For example, how did Vivian come to possess the ring, if Lady Margaret had locked it away and never worn it?" Doris said nothing. Miss Marple continued softly, "I believe the ring arrived in the post, sent in a parcel, and that it frightened Lady Margaret terribly." Doris nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "And then, after she passed, Vivian found it. Or perhaps someone gave it to her. Someone who said it should be displayed." Another nod. Miss Marple turned slightly to face her. "Who told her to show it, Doris?" The maid's hands clenched. "She didn't want to. I heard them arguing, Vivian and Mr. Carrow. A Mr. Carrow. The antique dealer from Westbourne. He visited Lady Margaret twice, years ago. She had him come about appraising some of the books. But he saw the ring, I think. Said it was older than anything else she owned. From Italy or Greece or somewhere. Said it belonged in a museum. Or on a stage. And he sent it back. I think so," Doris whispered. "I overheard Vivian. On the telephone one night. She said, you said it would be safe to show it. That it would bring them forward. That they'd pay for what they did." Miss Marple blinked. "Pay for what who did, Doris?" But the maid only shook her head. "I don't know. I don't think Vivian did either. She sounded so frightened." Miss Marple placed a comforting hand on the girl's arm. "You've done the right thing." Doris stood suddenly. "Please, don't tell them I told you. Please." And without waiting for a reply, she fled. Miss Marple sat still for some time, her thoughts moving quickly. So, Carrow. A name not yet in play. A dealer with an eye for rare items. He had known of the ring's existence before Lady Margaret died, possibly pressured her about it, perhaps even threatened exposure. And Vivian had inherited the fallout, perhaps the whole game. But what was the game? Why display the ring so publicly, and then speak of retribution? Miss Marple turned her gaze back toward the church spire. She now had her bait. if Mr. Carrow truly believed the ring's appearance would expose someone or something, then it stood to reason he was still watching, waiting for the one person who would react. And if that person hadn't reacted yet, Miss Marple would simply have to give them a final little push. That night she placed an advertisement in the Lavenstock Gazette, tucked discreetly on the bottom corner of the second page. Seeking provenance of unique platinum onyx heirloom ring, likely Mediterranean origin. Owner interested in confirming previous appraisals. Discretion assured. Contact JM via post or private messenger at St. Mary Mead. It was subtle, nothing too conspicuous, but it would do the trick. Within 24 hours, someone would knock at her door, or follow her through the village, or send a note pretending to inquire for someone else. Because the mystery now wasn't just about the ring. It was about whatever truth that ring had once concealed. And Miss Marple, for all her softness of tone and kindly eyes, had never been one to blink when the mask was finally pulled away. Chapter 8. A Visitor from Westbourne. The visitor arrived at 4:30 the following day, just as Miss Marple had expected, just as the rain began to spatter against the windows of her parlour. She had laid out the tea things with quiet precision and positioned her chair with its back to the fire, casting a soft glow over her shoulder. The house smelled faintly of lemon soap and lavender polish. A firm knock at the door was followed by a pause, just long enough for a man to compose himself. Mary, the housemaid, ushered him in moments later. "Mr. Carrow to see you, madam." Miss Marple rose. "How delightful! Please do come in." He was a man of 50 or so, with neatly slicked dark hair, a sharp-featured face, and clothes that attempted, though not quite successfully, to blend rustic charm with city sophistication. His boots were too new for walking paths, and the scarf tucked into his coat was pure affectation. His smile was practised but lacked warmth. "I hope I'm not imposing," he said, removing his gloves. "Not in the least," Miss Marple replied, offering him a seat. "I do appreciate promptness. It's a quality one sees less and less these days." Carrow settled himself into the chair across from her and glanced around the room, eyes alert behind his gentlemanly air. "I saw your notice in the Gazette," he said, "about the ring. Yes, I thought someone with a keen memory might assist in tracing its origin. I gather you have an interest in antique jewellery." "A lifelong fascination," he replied smoothly. "Mediterranean pieces, particularly. The ring you referenced, onyx set in platinum, would be quite unusual. May I ask where you encountered it?" Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, I saw it quite recently. It was worn by a dear young woman, Vivian Marchmont." If Carrow flinched, it was barely perceptible. "Ah, yes," he said after a pause. "A tragedy." Miss Marple nodded. "So sudden, and such a remarkable piece. Lady Margaret, I'm told, never wore it. You visited her once, I believe." "Twice," he corrected. "Years ago, to appraise a set of illuminated manuscripts. The ring came up in conversation." "She showed it to you?" "She mentioned it." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Said it had no provenance worth advertising, but I suspect it was much older than she realized." "How fascinating," said Miss Marple. She poured the tea carefully. "Milk? Please." She handed him a cup and then sat back with hers. "You see, what I find curious is that the ring seemed to reappear quite suddenly after Lady Margaret's passing. It was not itemized in the will, not bequeathed, yet there it was, worn openly at the garden fete. Caro sipped. Perhaps she left it to Miss Marchmont privately. Perhaps. Miss Marple tilted her head. Or perhaps it arrived by post, in a parcel, sent by someone who had handled it once before. Caro's cup halted just short of his mouth. That's quite a theory. Oh, I find theories most useful, she replied, especially when facts prefer to hide. She gave him a placid smile and added, Miss Marchmont was frightened, you know, not of the ring itself, but of what it represented. I believe she received it with instructions, something like, wear it, show it, someone will see it, someone will know. Caro set his cup down. You're making a great deal out of an old ornament. Not an ornament, Miss Marple said softly. A message. She stood and walked to the window. Outside, the rain tapped gently on. The glass, the village cloaked in grey. When someone sends a cursed object, she continued, it isn't always to harm. Sometimes it's to expose. Vivian wasn't the intended victim. She was the stage, the spotlight, the bait. She turned, and you were the playwright. Caro rose slowly. Miss Marple, I think this conversation is becoming uncomfortable. Yes, she said. That does tend to happen just before the truth arrives. There was a long pause. Caro's smile faded entirely. His eyes were calculating now, assessing the exits, perhaps regretting the visit. I suppose, he said, at last, you'll be speaking with the police next. Oh, I already have, Miss Marple said gently. Though I didn't name you, not yet, I thought it more polite to give you the opportunity to speak first. He stared at her for a long moment. Then, without another word, he turned and walked to the door. Mary opened it silently. The moment the door closed behind him, Miss Marple returned to her seat and resumed her knitting, her fingers moving swiftly. He had revealed nothing directly, but it was enough. She now knew 3 things. First, Caro had seen the ring and knew it for what it was. Second, he had wanted it revealed, though not for its beauty nor its value. He wanted it seen by someone specific. And third, that someone had not yet reacted, which meant, despite the first death, the story wasn't over. It had merely reached its intermission. Chapter 9. A Final Act in the Garden. The rain had cleared by the following afternoon, leaving a soft mist hanging over Lavenstock like a veil. The garden was wet, but the air was clear, and Miss Marple decided, with deliberate intention, to host one final gathering of those most involved in the curious death of Vivian Marchmont. She had sent no formal invitations. Rather, she had placed word in the right ears, and by 4 o'clock all her key players had arrived. Quietly, in the fashion that had now become familiar. The garden bench beneath the old yew tree had been cleared, the path swept clean, and Miss Marple waited patiently, seated with her knitting once again, as the last of the guests arrived. First was Isabel Hartley. She wore her usual dignified expression, though there was a subtle unease in the way she clasped her gloves. Then came Mr. Caro, the antique dealer. He too was dressed with more care than usual, and his sharp eyes quickly assessed the situation. Doris Bell arrived last, hesitantly, as though she had been summoned for something far more than a simple conversation. The maid's eyes flicked nervously toward the others, unsure of her place in the unfolding drama. Miss Marple watched them, all with her usual mild curiosity, but her mind was racing. The final pieces of the puzzle were close, so close now she could almost hear the edges clicking into place. "I trust you've all had a pleasant afternoon," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but clear enough to carry across the quiet garden. "Yes, thank you, Miss Marple," said Isabel, though her gaze lingered on Mr. Carrow for a moment longer than was polite. "Indeed?" Carrow replied, his tone still as smooth as ever, but with a hint of discomfort lurking just beneath. "I wasn't sure what this meeting was about, but it's always a pleasure to see a familiar face." "None of us were sure what this meeting was about," Miss Marple said, her tone still light. "But I think, between us, we'll get to the bottom of things." The maid, standing at the edge of the garden, fidgeted nervously. "What's this all about, Miss Marple?" she asked hesitantly. "I don't understand why I'm here." Miss Marple looked at her kindly. "You're here, Doris, because you know more than you think you do. You've been in the midst of this whole story from the beginning, and I believe it's time we all understood how." The maid looked down at the ground, her hands twisting in her apron. "I don't know anything really," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But you do," Miss Marple replied gently. "And that's why you must tell us what you know. All of us are here because we played a part in Vivian's death, and it's time we understood why." Doris's eyes darted between Isabel and Mr. Carrow, but it was clear now that she was beginning to understand the gravity of the situation. "I don't know anything," Doris repeated, but there was a flicker of doubt in her voice. Miss Marple smiled, the corners of her lips lifting just enough to show a hint of satisfaction. "That's precisely what you think, but I'm sure that once you begin, you'll recall far more than you realize." The air was thick with silence. Miss Marple didn't press. She simply waited. Her eyes never left Doris, whose hands were now shaking, her lower lip trembling. I saw her," Doris said in a low voice, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Miss Marchmont, I saw her 2 days before her death, in the early hours of the morning. She was at the window, holding the ring, and Mr. Carrow was there too. He was speaking to her in the garden, but not in a friendly way. He told her she had to wear it, that it was the only way to settle things." Isabel's face drained of colour. Carrow stiffened, his eyes narrowing. "That's a lie," he spat, his voice rising. "I've never spoken to the girl like that." "But you did," Miss Marple said, her voice cutting through the tension. "You told Vivian to show the ring, to expose it. You didn't want her to wear it, Mr. Carrow. You needed her to display it, to force someone into action." Carrow's jaw tightened, and for a moment it looked as though he might lash out. But instead, he took a slow breath and fixed his gaze on Miss Marple. "I had no choice," he said finally, his voice tight with restraint. "Vivian knew too much. She'd discovered the truth about the ring. Lady Margaret had tried to hide it, to bury it. But Vivian wanted it. She wanted to make sure that she inherited everything." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "And the parcel from the continent?" Carrow's lips tightened. "Yes, that was my doing. The ring had to be returned. Vivian needed it for her inheritance. You orchestrated it all," Miss Marple said softly. "You used Vivian, but you didn't expect her to die." Carrow's eyes flickered, and for the first time Miss Marple saw a hint of remorse in his features. He had pushed too far, miscalculated. Vivian had not been part of his plan. But her presence, her stubbornness in displaying the ring, had forced his hand. "You killed her," Doris whispered, barely audible. "You made her wear it. And then you—" She trailed off, unable to finish. Carrow took a step forward, his face hardening. "She was my last chance. I needed the ring, you don't understand. Without it, everything I had worked for would fall apart. I didn't mean for her to die. It was the shock, the stress." "And that was your mistake, wasn't it?" Miss Marple said. "You thought the ring would control things, but in the end it controlled you." There was a long pause. The weight of the confession hung in the air, thick and suffocating. "I thought I could manage it all," Carrow muttered, his voice low, but Vivian's death wasn't part of the plan. Miss Marple stood, folding her knitting with practised grace. "You see, Mr. Carrow, the thing about rings is that they don't care about people's plans. They come and they go, but they always leave behind a story." Isabel Hartley remained silent, her face pale but resolute. She had known the truth for far longer than she had let on. Miss Marple turned to Doris, who still stood in shock. "I'm afraid the story has come to an end, my dear, but at least now you know what it was all about." Doris nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. As Miss Marple walked back toward her cottage, the rain started again, but this time it didn't feel as oppressive. The air was cleaner, as though the village itself had exhaled after a long, silent wait. The mystery had unravelled, not through grand gestures or dramatic confessions, but through the quiet, patient observation of the simplest of truths. It had been about the ring, yes, but more importantly, it had been about what people were willing to do to own it. The curse, Miss Marple reflected, had never been on the ring itself. It had always been about the choices people made and the consequences they couldn't escape. Chapter 10. The final curtain. A week passed, and Lavenstock had begun, as villages always do, to resume its steady rhythm. The newspapers printed no great scandal, only a modest piece in the County Gazette titled, "Dealer Arrested in Local, Death Probe." The word murder was never used. The Crown opted for manslaughter, citing emotional manipulation and coercion as indirect causes of Vivian Marchmont's death. There was no poison, no weapon, only pressure, fear, and a heart that could no longer withstand the weight of secrets. Mr. Carrow, having been arrested quietly the morning after his confession, made no attempt to deny the facts. He claimed it hadn't intended for Vivian to die, and perhaps that was true. But in the end, his carefully plotted theatre of inheritance, guilt, and exposure had claimed a life, and no one mourned him when he was led away. Doris Bell was granted a modest bequest from Lady Margaret's original will, which Miss Marple had seen restored with help from Colonel Melrose and Mr. Hartley. The servant, so long overlooked, now found herself with a future she had never imagined. She left Ormsley House shortly thereafter, and took a position in Devon, far from the ring and the memories it carried. Isabel Hartley remained in Lavenstock. When offered the chance to reclaim her inheritance, she refused most of it, keeping only the cottage and Lady Margaret's collection of botanical journals. It was never about money. she told Miss Marple quietly. Only about truth. The ring, after all its theatrics, was placed in a bank vault under court seal. Its fate uncertain. There were whispers it might be donated to a museum, though Miss Marple thought it more likely to disappear again, back into some velvet-lined box, buried beneath papers, waiting for its next chapter. And as for Ormsley House, it stood empty, its once proud facade now dulled by ivy and silence. No one rushed to buy it, and no villagers spoke of it fondly. Like a theatre with its final curtain drawn, it had seen its last performance. On a warm morning not long after, Miss Marple sat in her garden in St. Mary Mead, a new ball of yarn on her lap and a fresh cup of tea by her side. She had just finished reading a letter from Isabel Hartley, who had sent thanks once again for Miss Marple's help, along with a pressed violet from Lady Margaret's herbarium. The doorbell rang, Mary answered, and a moment later Reverend Pomeroy appeared at the garden gate, hat in hand. "I do hope I'm not intruding," he said. "I was walking past and thought I'd stop in." "Not at all, Reverend. Do come sit. The birds are particularly well behaved today." He chuckled and took the seat opposite her. "Such a strange business," he said after a pause. "That ring, all that fear, all that history." Miss Marple nodded. "It was never about the ring, of course. No, it was about guilt. Lady Margaret carried the memory of betrayal. Mr. Carrow carried the bitterness of being denied. Vivian, poor girl, carried the weight of both without truly understanding them. The ring was simply a symbol, passed from hand to hand like a stage prop, while the real drama played out behind it." The Reverend looked thoughtful. "Do you believe it was cursed?" Miss Marple smiled, the lines at her eyes softening. "No, Reverend, but I do believe that people are very good at cursing themselves." He nodded, and they sat together in the gentle quiet, the garden full of birdsong and sunlight. And for a moment there was peace. Then, after a pause, the Reverend cleared his throat. "You're quite remarkable, Miss Marple. I do wonder how you manage to see so much that others don't." She picked up her knitting once again, her fingers moving deftly. "Oh, it's simply that people are very alike, you know. They lie for the same reasons: love, pride, revenge, and they always tell the truth in the same way too, quietly, when they think no one's listening." The Reverend smiled. "And you're always listening." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Yes," she said, "always."